So today we're going to go through how to make a reusable Nespresso pod for both the Nespresso Vertuo machines and the Nespresso Original machines. I'll talk about which pod kits I like the most and which pod kits I'm not quite a fan of. Let's start with the Vertuo machines. Now for the Vertuo pods, these dome-shaped pods, I recommend you use a foil lid kit on an existing pod. Like this one that I have here from Aeve. Now to refill it, you're going to take your used pod, put in this nice little wooden holder, which I really like. Get an X-Acto knife and cut off the lid. Just kind of rotate the pod around, quickly cut off the lid here. You can actually recycle this foil. Now you want to dump out that used coffee. You want to make sure you fully clean this out. And I actually want to use these pods probably within a week of using them, because otherwise they can start growing some mold. Put this back. There's two things you want to do to get a good reusable pod. One of them is get the grind size right, and the second is get the dose right. So the grind size, you want to use something that's close to an espresso grind, but not quite too fine. Maybe finer than table salt, but not quite powdered sugar. Now I'm using the Baratza Encore ESP here, which has grind settings from espresso all the way up to cold brew. I found the settings that work best are probably the 18 to 20 settings on this grinder. Now, in terms of dose, it depends on what pod you're using. You can go from 7 grams for an espresso pod all the way up to 18 grams for a craft pod. Now, I'll put the exact measurements on the screen, and they'll also be on our blog, which will be linked in the description below. You can use a scale like this Apex Stone scale here to weigh it out, but honestly, it's not totally necessary. I just found if you fill up the coffee all the way, then tamp it down a little bit, that'll be enough. Use this little brush off any loose coffee. Then you just want to put the foil lid right over the middle. Now, I don't think you have to overthink much of this process, but one thing you do need to make sure of is that you really firmly press down the edges of this foil lid. Otherwise, it can slip off, you get a bunch of ground coffee in your cup, or the foil can rip. There you have it. You got a refill pod. Okay, let's test it. Just put it in as per normal. Close the machine. And there you have it. We got our another cup of coffee. It's not quite the size of the crema as before, but it is actually a little bit of a lighter crema too. Tastes like a cup of coffee. So these foil lid kits are the ones I like the most. So let's talk about some of the other Vertuo kits out there. So one thing you can do is you can get these reusable metal pods here that you can refill every time. So on one of them, you can see that there's not even a barcode, and the Vertuo machine does need a barcode to work. I have not had success with these. When I used the same grind size here, it didn't flow. And then when I actually used a coarser grind size, it would flow, but it was actually quite a weak coffee. And so I just never had success with these. Now you can also use these silicone reusable lids, which you can actually just take, and then you can kind of put it inside an existing pod once you refill it, and it's just easier than sealing it with aluminum. Now, I've actually had some serious issues with this silicone lid. The first time I did it, I used the same grind size, and it actually clogged my machine. It created some pretty serious issues where I had a flashing red light, and I could not even open the machine. I had to unplug it, replug it back in to empty it out, and it almost ruined my Vertuo Plus. Then the second time, I made sure to grind coarser, a lot coarser, and then I just got a pretty weak coffee. So these silicone lids, I've just not had any success with. I'd really recommend using these foil lids for the top of your pods. It actually just mimics the regular Vertuo pod, and I found the ones from Aeve or Camp Messo have worked really well. I'll put both those in the description below. Now let's talk about refilling an original Nespresso machine pod. Now here you do need to use these metal refillable pods like this kit from TriPilot. And the reason you need to use a metal refillable pod is because the machine actually punctures the bottom and you can't reuse it. Now, these pods take a little bit of a finer grind, but still within that 18 to 20 setting on the Baratza Encore ESP. And you do need to really get 5 grams in here, which is a little harder to do because you have to pack it in. So let's get the scale for this one. Tamp this down a little bit. I just want to make sure you remove all the coffee from the edges so the foil lid will stick. And this time it's usually a little easier to put this foil lid on. Okay, now let's try brewing this pod. I've noticed it can seem like it gets stuck when you put it in the machine. You do just have to press down a little harder. I've never had an issue with it actually getting stuck. So this one flowed a little bit slower. Still actually has a decent crema on it. Actually a more espresso-like crema. Actually turned out really well. I was really happy with this. So I ground probably a little too fine, but this turned out great. So just some final tips. First off, I noticed these reusable pods don't stay fresh as long. The seal is not quite as tight, no matter how hard you try and press down on the lids. So it's best to make only a week's supply at a time. And second, you should use a darker roasted coffee. The espresso machines don't brew quite as hot as a regular espresso machine, so it's really hard to use a lighter roast in there. Now, as always, I hope this helps. If you have any questions or comments, let me know down below. And if you enjoyed this video, consider hitting like, spread the word around, and make sure you subscribe to see some future videos.